Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. It was, Keir Starmer said before his trip to Beijing in late January, time to end the ice age in relations between the UK and China. After the golden age promised by former Prime Minister David Cameron more than a decade ago, it had been 8 long years since a British leader last visited the country. Years characterised by tensions over China's crackdowns on Democrats in Hong Kong and the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang, and over Beijing's close ties with Vladimir Putin. In the UK, these tensions have been highlighted by a case of alleged spying involving a parliamentary researcher, which was abruptly abandoned by the government last autumn, and by criticisms of the siting of China's new embassy, approved just before Keir Starmer's visit, in a heritage building close to the City of London. And with Hong Kong newspaper publisher Jimmy Lai recently found guilty of violating China's national security laws, and the organisers of vigils commemorating the Tiananmen crackdown also currently on trial in Hong Kong, the UK Prime Minister had faced calls from some British politicians and media not to visit China at this time. He returned with an agreement for visa-free travel to China for British tourists, in line with other European countries, and the dropping of Chinese sanctions against 6 British MPs and peers who had criticised Beijing's policies in Xinjiang. He also said he had had a respectful discussion with President Xi Jinping about the case of Jimmy Lai, whose release he has described as a priority. There was also some rather vague talk of exploring market access to China's highly restricted service sector, as well as a lowering of tariffs on Scotch whisky and the announcement of a big British pharmaceutical investment in China. Yet Donald Trump called Starmer's embrace of Beijing very dangerous, and critics at home, perhaps inevitably, accused him of kowtowing to China. So how realistic is Keir Starmer's vision of a sophisticated relationship with Beijing, in which he says the UK will cooperate, compete and challenge as appropriate? To discuss this, I'm joined by Professor Steve Tsang, specialist on Chinese politics and director of the SOAS China Institute, and by SOAS research associate Jonathan Fenby, former editor of Britain's Observer newspaper and Hong Kong's South China Morning Post, and author of many books on recent Chinese history, including The Penguin History of Modern China. Well, thank you both for joining us. So, Jonathan, do you think it was wise of Keir Starmer to go to Beijing at this point?
I think it was a wise move in terms of, if we go to the post-Davos, the Carney speech at Davos, which really focused attention on mid-sized powers like the UK. Where do they navigate in the world today?
You're talking about Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister's comments at the meeting at Davos just in January.
Yeah, which was really about drawing attention to the difficult situation which mid-sized powers like Canada or like the UK have in the present world, what Starmer described as a volatile world, and which Xi Jinping keeps describing as being full of more challenges than we've seen in our lifetimes. And I think in that context, given China's importance politically and economically in the world, it was quite a sensible move to open up doors again. The actual economic benefits from the visit were pretty minor, but I don't think anybody expected anything spectacular. And the British line very much is that what we've done is we've opened up a new channel to the top in Beijing, to Xi Jinping, and that will be noticed in China and will help us move ahead.
Obviously, Keir Starmer came in for plenty of criticism in the UK for going to China, particularly in this context of suspicion regarding the Chinese embassy building, which has just been approved by Keir Starmer's government in London in the old Royal Mint Court building, with allegations that it could, make it easier for China to spy on data traffic in and out of the City of London. His opponents, like Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, said, I would have not gone to China in this context. And the Daily Mail, which is always a critic of the Labour government, had a front page headline talking about capitulation in Beijing.
Yeah.
So what do you feel about the political context? Did he achieve enough to kind of mollify his critics?
Well, obviously, for the right and for the Conservative Party under its present leadership, any engagement with China will be engaging with the bogeyman. And certainly the way China operates gives reason for suspicion and caution. So I think that engagement is correct, but one should keep a great deal of caution at the same time. And one should not overestimate the potential for scoring spectacular wins in economic terms with China, or indeed political terms, such as over Jimmy Lai or the Uyghurs.
So, Steve Tsang, you've obviously also observed all these issues, and we've had this, as I say, the great tension over the Chinese embassy and the permission for the new building in London. We had this spy case where these defendants were accused of undermining national security. That was then withdrawn rather suddenly. In terms of what Keir Starmer can actually achieve in the relationship with China in the current context, in the context of Britain's current status outside the European Union, a relatively smaller power in many respects than countries like the US, which China takes so seriously. Where do you think Britain stands, and what does a visit like this achieve?
I think looking at the visit, we are looking at the tree and ignoring the forest. It is entirely positive and good that the UK is putting relationship with China on more like an even keel. But we should bear in mind, so what next? What are we improving that relationship to achieve? Now, there is no indication from the Starmer government or indeed from any of the senior UK politicians on what our longer term objective in our relationship with China should be. Now, the fundamental problem here is that we have China policies, and China policies swing and drift and change. And that happens because we don't have a long-term China strategy that visualize what we want in that relationship in 10, 20, 25 years kind of time frame. In contrast, China has a long-term global strategy under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping wants to deliver the China dream of national rejuvenation by 2050. And that essentially is about making China great again, which also requires transforming the international order from a rule-based liberal international order into a rule-based Sino-centric order. Is that a new world order that the United Kingdom, with its commitments to its core values in human rights, democracies, and freedom, feel comfortable in? And that's what we should be thinking about. That's what we should be wanting to use the diplomatic even keel to achieve. If we don't do that, improving relationship in the short term on its own is not going to get us anywhere.
Well, Keir Starmer did obviously say that he believed that by engaging with China and having greater sort of consistency, as he put it, of relations rather than swinging from hot to cold, Britain could actually achieve more. Do you think that there is any way that Britain could do this? Is it politically possible for the UK to apply any leverage to China these days?
Oh, I think if we actually have a clear strategy, and a strategy which is long-term, will have to be bipartisan. If we don't have a bipartisan long-term strategic vision in how we engage with China, we will always have our China policy swinging. And in terms of whether we actually have leverage on China, we have to understand why China sees the UK as valuable. And I think China does see UK as valuable because we have delivered in the last 10 years a spectacular win for China. It was the UK's joining of AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which was originally conceived and set up as an institution to support the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in developing countries.
To support the BRI, the Belt and Road, which is Chinese loans to countries around the world.
And indeed, and it was largely not being seen as a credible international development agency. But the UK joining it led to a whole lot of other major mature democratic economies joining AIIB, which propelled the AIIB to become a completely credible, internationally accepted international development agency following best practices. And the Chinese know that if the UK had not done it, all those would not have happened. So we do, in that sense, have leverage. We are being seen as a major individual player in the so-called democratic West. China wants to engage with us. They want a mega embassy in London, not in Berlin, not in Paris, because they think changing how the UK government thinks and acts can have effect on the unity or indeed disunity of the democratic West. So we can play what the Chinese see in terms of our values to them in order to engage with ways to secure what we want. The Chinese are doing it, we are not at the moment.
Is there something Britain can do to make use of this position? Just going back to, for example, the case of Jimmy Lai, Steve, I mean, do you see any serious chance that Keir Starmer would have enough leverage to get Jimmy Lai released? You know, if we go back to, for example, the late 1990s, we would see dissidents released by China and put on planes to the US ostensibly for medical care. You know, the Chinese would say, oh, well, they have health problems, we're sending them abroad for treatment. But this would be something of a fig leaf to cover up the fact that China was making some kind of a concession. We have rarely seen anything like that in recent years. Is something like that still possible with Hong Kong?
In terms of people like Jimmy Lai and Hong Kong Democrats, there is clearly a very large limitation to what Prime Minister Starmer or the UK as a whole can do to change China's policy. China today is very different from China even a decade ago or two decades ago. Those were the days when China still needed or felt it needed international acceptance and recognition. Today's China believes that China's moment has come. Xi Jinping is here to dictate terms. Xi Jinping is not here to accept other people's terms. And the arrest and detention of Jimmy Lai reflects a personal preference of Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping has never backed off on something like that.
A personal preference.
That Jimmy Lai, in the Xi Jinping kind of view, is effectively a traitor. And therefore, Xi Jinping will expect Jimmy Lai to die in prison. And that being the case, I think realistically, if Starmer had put Jimmy Lai's case at the front burner and basically say, let Jimmy Lai out, or else we don't actually have any deal, then he will return to the UK with no deal at all.
I agree entirely with that. And I think China has changed since the days of Jiang Zemin over the last 20 years. And it is a much more self-confident, wishing to be self-reliant nation, which isn't going to accept any lessons from anybody else, and particularly wouldn't budge on Hong Kong, including Jimmy Lai's detention, particularly if it was seen to be done under any kind of foreign pressure. So the more that the right in Britain makes standing up to China its kind of leitmotif and its standard cry, the more difficult relations would become, and you'll be back in an ice age. I think also, to add to what Steve was just saying about long-term plans, Starmer's task is internationally is incredibly much more complicated by the nature of Trump, by Trump's relationship with China and how he sees that relationship, and also by Brexit and Britain being outside the EU. So Britain doesn't have the benefit of being a member of the big club, the EU, anymore in its dealings with China. And I think Trump's remark that Starmer's visit was quote, very dangerous, unquote, really reflects his own feeling that he will deal with Xi Jinping and others shouldn't get involved.
Because obviously Donald Trump himself is planning to go, as far
He's
as we
planning to
know,
go in. He's
in
planning to
April.
go in April. He's planning to go in April, and I think part of his annoyance with Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, and the deals he did in Beijing, were down to somebody else interfering in what he sees as a meeting of supermen.
Well, obviously, we saw the British government, trumpeting some deals being done and a big AstraZeneca in
Yeah,
investment in pharmaceuticals. And some people
but
said
in
this would
China,
have happened anyway in China.
not in Britain. This
Well,
is the strange thing, that the AstraZeneca deal is being touted, but actually AstraZeneca, having paused on an investment in Cambridge, then went ahead with China. And I think that tells you something. Britain's applause for it tells you something else.
one big Chinese investment in Britain, which has been discussed and was discussed during the visit, is by this Chinese company, Mingyang, to build a factory making wind turbines in
Yeah.
Scotland. And that is also, in theory, on hold while the security implications are discussed. And, this is now a major question, isn't it? Because much investment is going from China into Europe. But many of the areas, which include things like electric vehicles, for example, are seen by many people in the West as potentially security risks. For example, I believe that the former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, made the point last week that, with electric vehicles, China could just switch them all off.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the theory, again, with technology in wind farms and the kind of software upgrades that will constantly be needed, in theory, from the Chinese manufacturers. How seriously should we be taking those issues? And, should or will that stop countries like the UK doing business with China in some of these areas?
The answer is no. It won't stop countries like the UK doing business with China, simply because China's so far ahead in these terms, and economically it makes so much sense. But the security issues have to be taken into account, and taken very seriously indeed.
And is there a solution? I mean, is it going to be viable for all these Chinese energy saving products to be used in Europe without people being worried about the security implications?
The real issue here is about whether software updates for EVs or wind turbines or any of those new technology items needs to be done, and will they be done remotely from China? If they will be, then the Chinese can control those machineries and they can
Yeah.
stop them and immobilize them at a critical strategic junction in the relationship between UK and China in the future. But it is largely a one-shot operation. If the Chinese Communist Party order that to happen, they can do it once. After that, every other British or European and other major democratic economies will try to replace those Chinese critical infrastructures by others which are not vulnerable to Chinese remote shutdown. So the risk of the Chinese doing that is actually quite low in an ordinary setting, but in a future situation when our relationship reach breaking point, then they have that critical moment of using that technological capacity to immobilize us or to threaten us, to force us to make a major concession. And what we need to make sure is that if we build in those infrastructures, we do the software updates domestically by our own people and not subject to that being done remotely in China.
If you look at Britain's place in the world now and China's view of its own importance, I mean, how seriously is China interested in, for example, that kind of potential control over the British economy, if you like. Or, it goes back to this other issue that was raised by a lot of the people who criticized the plans to open this Chinese super embassy in London, which were based on the idea that it was close to the city of London, therefore it would make it easier for China to potentially hack into cables carrying data which run close by to their new embassy. Is Britain important enough that China would be seriously thinking about doing these kind of things?
I think we have to go back to Xi Jinping's global strategy. What he wants to do is to make China great again, essentially to re-establish, in quotation marks, re-establish Chinese global preeminence at some point. Now, that's not something which I think the Chinese government is expecting to happen in the next few years or even next 5-10 years. Their time frame is about 2049, 2050. So when that moment comes, there will have to be a major event to mark that. And that's probably a Chinese forceful takeover of Taiwan. And a country like the UK would be directly engaged by the US government at the time to be taking a side. That's probably the kind of moment when we're looking at when the Chinese will say, okay, please, we are friends, don't do it. Otherwise, your electricity will stop, your cars will run to a standstill, and various other infrastructures will simply not function. You don't want that to happen, do you? Just back off. Taiwan's not your business.
Yeah.
In terms of the embassy, I think we have to be a bit more realistic about it. If the Chinese want to build a mega embassy with a historic building that looks sufficiently grand, there are very, very few such potential sites in London. I mean, the idea that they picked the Royal Mint Court site because of the telecom substations being next to it, I think is expecting something of the Chinese that is probably slightly more Machiavellian than the Chinese themselves would necessarily have started off when they pick that site. And we will also have to bear in mind that we may have a government that is constantly muttering through, but we don't have a government that is staffed totally by irresponsible idiots. They would have consulted GCHQ and the Cybersecurity Center, and they would have got confirmations that the telecom substation is not posing a national security threat that cannot be surmounted. We should also bear in mind that a building fundamentally does not spy, a building does not infiltrate. It's the people working in the building who do that. And the people are already in London, scattered around 7 or 8 different sites. Putting them all into one site is not going to make them more efficient. It will make it easier for MI5 to keep watch on them.
You make an interesting point there, Steve. I mean, this may be a bit of a tangent, but you raise the point that China wants a building that looks sufficiently grand for how it sees its place in the world now. And, what we do see, I think, with Britain in China is there is still this interest in China in sort of British heritage. That goes to things like culture and the massive popularity, for example, of the BBC's Sherlock a decade or so ago. But is there actually an argument that they wanted a building like this because it looks like sort of heritage and it will make them feel that they've arrived in high society in London, as it were?
I think that is certainly one of the factors. It's a very different approach to the Americans with the American embassy site in Nine Elms. The Americans were going to build a completely new structure from the ground up.
Which opened a few years ago, as you say, close to the river, and it's a very, very modernist building, separate from everything else around it.
It's comparable in scales to what the Chinese are trying to build. And the Chinese have no intention of building something like that, which would have been a building much more useful for them for both intelligence or counterintelligence operations than an existing listed building. But they prefer the existing listed building, I think, precisely for the prestige reasons that is associated with the past of the United Kingdom.
I agree entirely. I think, moving out of Portland Place, their present embassy, which is a pretty unimpressive building for the Royal Mint would have been definitely seen as a prestige move. And that still counts for something in China. Whether it counts for anything in the geopolitical scales is a completely different question.
Well, I mean, one thing it presumably will do is also unlock plans to spend something like £100 million to rebuild effectively the British embassy in Beijing, which again
Yes.
is a fairly old and crumbling building, but with enough land to build something new on. And that had also been on hold. So presumably we're likely to see something of a quid pro quo there.
Yeah, but I think going back to what Steve was saying earlier, the important thing is that as far as one knows, the British intelligence services have said there is no danger from this embassy. And certainly the Chinese would be mad to concentrate all their espionage and spying and counter-spying on that one easily trackable place.
And what about this spy case, which got a lot of publicity in the UK of these two young British men, one based in China, one a researcher at the House of Commons with connections to several Conservative MPs in something called the China Research Group. That then fell apart, really. The reason given was that under the Official Secrets Act, which the case was being brought under, the Director of Public Prosecutions would have had to prove that China was an enemy of the UK. But other observers suggest that it fell apart because some of the claims that this British man in China had met, very, very senior members of the Politburo to pass on what seemed like relatively basic information about the views of some parliamentarians, that this was not seen as being particularly credible. Steve, I mean, do you have a view on this case and the significance of it? I mean, is it really a reflection more of just anxiety about China, or is it a sign that China is constantly trying to gain footholds and influence in politics? I mean, we've also seen another case where researchers for MPs have been accused of espionage as well.
Great powers who are not close friends spy on each other. That is pretty normal. And great powers who are not friends trying to influence each other is also normal. The really important point about the spy case is the evidence presented in the prosecution that Chai Chi, officially ranked number 5 in the Chinese establishment, and in effect, Xi Jinping's right-hand man, spent a very short period of time talking to one of the two alleged spies for China. The significance of it is that if Chai Chi would spend time on meeting even very briefly with one of these potential Chinese agents in the UK system, reflects how important they see an approach of this kind amounts to. If you understand the British parliamentary system, you will realize that parliamentary assistance has a higher probability of running for and becoming MPs in the British system than professionals in any other professions. The likelihood that in 10, 15 years' time, that parliamentary assistant is a sitting MP is quite a good one, particularly when you're dealing with one of the two major parties in the parliamentary system. If that party wins power with 340 plus seats, there is 1 in 3 chance that your candidate would make a minister at some point.
We should, of course, clarify that these two men were acquitted and the case was dropped. So you're talking more about the theory of why China might be interested and why the security services in Britain would be concerned about this kind of approach.
Absolutely. Our system means that if the case did not go to court and they are not found guilty, then we must assume that they are actually innocent. What I'm talking about is why the Chinese would be even interested in it. And the evidence being presented so far would suggest the Chinese are interested in it potentially for that reason. And that would make a lot of sense for them to be engaged at that level.
So you do think in that context that Britain is somehow still important enough to China that it would be interested in having this leverage over people in the parliamentary system or in government?
I think that is a very important point, because we are still being seen by Beijing as valuable. Therefore, we still have cards to play.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think Britain still has an importance in Beijing's mind. Whether that importance is justified or not is another question.
Well, I mean, obviously, Britain is also still a member of the UN Security Council. I mean,
Is still a member of NATO and is still involved in Ukraine. And there are lots of areas where China, you can see, has an interest in how Britain behaves and also how Britain behaves vis-a-vis the United States.
you mentioned Ukraine, for example. Clearly, there has been this question of whether anyone could get China to put pressure on Russia
Yeah.
over Ukraine. We haven't seen signs of significant moves, although, of course, China has said it wants peace in Ukraine. Steve, I mean, what do you feel about Britain's position on this type of issue? Is there any way that Britain can exert pressure on China on an issue like that, or is it now impossible for China to be moved on this type of issue?
I think the idea that the UK can influence China over Ukraine is for the birds. I would go as far as to say the idea that any major Western countries can influence China over Ukraine, potentially excepting the United States, is unrealistic. China has a clear position over the Ukraine war. From the get-go, from the time when the invasion happened, the Chinese position has been one of openly declaring neutrality, actively supporting Putin, adamantly refusing to pay any price for the war. The war has turned out to be in China's benefit. It's hugely disrupted the NATO alliance. It demonstrated the liberal international order is bankrupt, is not functioning, and therefore changes need to happen, which is what China wants to come in and make those changes and make the international order much more to China's liking. And therefore, for all the Chinese rhetoric about the war should end, we have seen next to no real action.
Yeah.
Shortly after the war started, when the Russian invading forces were bogged down, China or Xi Jinping would have been the only world leader at that point who could have done a subtle diplomacy between Moscow and Kyiv. China had good strategic partnership with Zelensky's government in Ukraine before the invasion. He would have been the only world leader who could have done it. He did not try to do so. He didn't bother.
Jonathan, I mean, that sort of goes back to your point about the status of medium-sized powers vis-a-vis the US and China in the current world order.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. And I think that is the difficulty that Starmer faces. And he more or less recognized it in various comments that he made during the visit to China and subsequently. It's the difficulty of balancing Trump, Xi, and the EU. Never forget the Europeans too, because you've got there Macron and certainly the Germans and the Commission in Brussels, which want to forge their own path. And all this is a very volatile situation. And indeed, you could say that actually encouraging Britain is in China's interests, because it may make life more difficult for the EU and for Trump.
When you say encouraging Britain in what respect?
Encouraging Britain to think that it can develop a relationship, a political as well and economic relationship with China.
So it's a sort of divide and rule tactic.
Yes, I think that's always applied to China's policy towards the West.
In this context, in terms of engagement, this is an issue now for countries around the world with China. We've seen the US, for example, becoming very anxious about having large numbers of Chinese students and particularly scientific researchers in its universities. But Britain has done very well from Chinese students coming to the UK in huge numbers in the last couple of decades. So we saw during the visit, for example, that also Keir Starmer came back with this news that China had given visa-free access to British tourists, that they will now be allowed to go for 30 days without getting a visa, which I think in practical terms is obviously quite convenient for many people. It's something actually that most European countries have already had over the past few years post-COVID. So clearly Britain has decided, or the current British government has decided, that it is time after, a bit of a ice age, as Keir Starmer put it, to re-engage with China in many ways. And that will, I'm sure, include trying to get more students to come, because the growth in the numbers has definitely slowed in recent years. And it's very important financially to British universities. So I just wonder, is that just realpolitik in the current world, that we're going to engage with China on a sort of people-to-people basis, whether through tourism or education, but that does mean accepting some aspects of what China does, which many people in the West have been critical of. For example, Keir Starmer also announced that China had lifted sanctions against 6 serving British MPs and peers, but they themselves then came out with a statement saying they'd rather remain under sanction than have their status used as a bargaining chip, which they said could be used to lift the British sanctions that were put on officials involved with the hardline policy in Xinjiang, where people were being sent for re-education in labour camps. And, we don't see any signs that whole issue has suddenly gone away. So, Steve, I mean, how do you've been involved in education, you've seen the pressures, you, I believe, have experienced them yourselves from China on academia sometimes in the West. So where do you think Britain stands, and where should it stand now?
In terms of the lifting of restrictions on parliamentarians, it really needs to be lifting of restrictions on British citizens going to China, period. Allowing the Chinese government to pick and choose that parliamentarians will now lift the restrictions, but for academics and other NGO people or dissidents, those bans stay.
Yeah, so that includes, for example, Joe Smith-Finlay, who's an academic at Newcastle University, focusing on Uyghurs and Xinjiang.
And a few others. Now, that's really not a very good deal that we actually have got from the Chinese at all. And that's a separate issue from the exchange of individuals and academic exchanges. As a professor in political science, I would, of course, welcome more exchange with our Chinese partners and more Chinese students coming to the UK to study subjects like political science. But I think where we have to be careful is that there are areas and subjects where we can have unrestricted number of Chinese students and academic visitors coming. There are subjects and areas of research where collaboration will have a strong national security implication, and we have to be very careful with those cooperations. And indeed, some of them need to be completely closed off. And that will have to be decided by the government through its consultation with the national security people, who will be able to say, these are the subjects, technologies that have national security implications. And we should simply have a list that spells out, these are the areas that you cannot cooperate. And all other areas will be open to normal academic exchange and contacts. The one thing we do have to bear in mind is that the university sector is not one single unit. There are enormous amount of diversities in the university sectors. There are a few UK universities which are already so heavily dependent on Chinese student intakes that they are vulnerable to pressure being applied by the Chinese state or embassy in getting them to do or not do certain things. For most of the UK universities, they are not in that kind of situation, and we should not conflate the two. So the student number as a source of income is a lever that the Chinese party state can use and is known to have used, and the government will need to address that issue as well. You cannot simply leave it to individual universities. And it does require the funding model for British universities to be adjusted to eliminate this particular vulnerability.
So you're talking about the fact that so much of the income comes from foreign students because they pay higher fees?
And some universities have become so overly dependent on the source of student income from one country.
Well, Keir Starmer, after his meeting with Xi Jinping, quoted a story that Xi Jinping had apparently told him, an old Chinese story about a blind man being presented with an elephant. And the quote was, one person touches the leg and thinks it's a pillow, another feels the belly and thinks it's a wall. Too often this reflects that China is only seen in a sort of piecemeal way. So Keir Starmer said, I profoundly believe that broader and deeper engagement is our way of seeing the whole elephant and therefore building a more sophisticated relationship fit for the times. It sounds from what you're both saying that there are still many elephants in the room.
There are many elephants with many questionable elements to them.
What I think we should take from the Prime Minister's statement is that he sees the problem, but he has not come up with the solution. The solution is for the United Kingdom to spend a lot more in promoting the understanding and the study of China so that we can see the elephant in its entirety. And if we are looking at the long-term strategic relationship with China as a potential national security threat, just for comparison purposes, the cost of one single destroyer for the UK defense budget would more than cover what will be needed to make that study of China sufficiently well-funded to build up the capacity to make sure that we don't end up in a situation with China that we will need to deploy any destroyer at all.
You're saying we should be spending more on studies of Chinese culture or particularly politics? What is it that you think is lacking?
Well, I would say the whole lot of it, but understanding the politics and the dynamics behind the politics and the strategic approach China takes towards technologies and engagements would be far more important than understanding the finer elements of the beautiful culture and civilization of China. But we should not make them as a zero-sum game. I would say the cost of a destroyer will enable us to, in fact, do both.
Well, Steve Tsang and Jonathan Fenby, thank you both very, very much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find information on SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.